My pregnant daughter begged me to steal her sister's wedding. I agreed, and it destroyed my family. I used to believe that being a mother meant giving love equally, that my heart could stretch without limits, and my choices would never weigh heavier on one child than the other. But when I look back now, I realize love was never the problem. The problem was how I gave it, who I gave it to more, and who I assumed didn't need it. I have 2 daughters, and though they were born only 3 years apart, they could not have been more different. Clara, my firstborn, came into the world with a kind of fierce independence. Even as a little girl, she was the one who tied her own shoes before I even noticed the laces were undone. She chased her own goals, rarely asking for help, almost as if she knew I already had my hands full. And then there was Sophie. She was fragile from the very beginning. Asthma, panic attacks, struggles at school. I found myself holding her hand through every setback, every tear, every sleepless night. I told myself any mother would have done the same. She needed me more, and Clara would be fine. That was the story I repeated in my head for years, until it no longer sounded like a choice, but a truth. I poured myself into Sophie. Time, money, attention, always believing I was saving her. And I let Clara stand alone, convincing myself that her strength was proof she didn't need me. At the time, it felt justified. But when I think about the distance in Clara's eyes today, I can't help but wonder if every moment I leaned toward Sophie was another stone laid in the wall that grew between me and my eldest. When people speak of childhood, they often recall warmth, birthday candles, holiday laughter, a sense of safety tucked inside the walls of home. My memories are not without those things, but threaded through them is something darker, something I refused to acknowledge for years. Clara grew up in the shadow of her younger sister's fragility. She was the child who came home waving a perfect report card, only to be met with distracted nods because Sophie was in the middle of another anxiety attack. She was the girl who saved her allowance for weeks to buy her first pair of ballet shoes, only to watch me spend twice as much on Sophie's watercolor set because I thought art would calm her nerves. There was one night I can never forget. Clara had been invited to a science fair after winning first place at school. She had built a small solar-powered car, tiny but ingenious, and she begged me to come see it. But that same morning, Sophie had an asthma flare-up. I remember kneeling beside Sophie's bed, pressing an inhaler to her lips, promising her she would be fine. And when I looked up, I saw Clara standing in the doorway in her little dress, holding that car in her hands, waiting for me to say I'd be there. She didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't even slam her door. She just turned and walked away. Her shoulders squared in that way children should never have to learn. Years later, she told me she won second place without me there to see it. She said it without anger, almost casually, but I felt the blade behind her words, and still, I carried on. When Sophie struggled with friendships, I arranged therapists, tutors, new hobbies, anything to shield her from the world. When Clara asked why Sophie could borrow her clothes without asking, why Sophie had her own new laptop while Clara used the old family computer, I gave the same response over and over. You're the strong one. You don't need as much. The years passed, and Clara learned to rely on herself, while Sophie learned that someone would always catch her when she fell. I told myself that was balance, that I had created stability in the household. But what I really created was distance. One daughter resentful, the other dependent, and me blind to the widening rift between them. What I didn't realize then was how those quiet wounds from the past would resurface years later, on the very day Clara should have been happiest, when she finally announced her engagement. The news did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived in the small, careful way important things often do, tucked inside an ordinary Sunday afternoon. Clara came by with a bakery box and a quiet smile that made her look younger than she had in years. She waited until the kettle sang, until my husband set 2 cups on the table. Then she lifted the lid and revealed a single lemon tart with a ring resting in its sugared center, a circle of light winking up at us like a secret that had finally decided to step into daylight. For a second, I forgot how to speak. Michael followed her into the kitchen with a bouquet that looked too large for our worn countertop, and when he reached for Clara's hand, there was nothing tentative in the gesture. It felt declarative, a promise in plain sight. She told us. He had proposed on the overlook where they used to take walks after long workdays. She described the wind in the trees, the small blue box he could barely open with his shaking hands, the way she laughed because he was the one trembling. My husband laughed too, but I could see his eyes gloss, a softness he rarely let anyone witness. Clara has always carried herself like an adult no matter the room, but as she spoke that day, she sounded like the child I once tucked into bed. I saw her at 6, balancing on the curb with her arms spread wide. At 13, holding up a medal after a science fair I missed. At 23, signing the lease on her first apartment without asking for help. All those versions of my daughter stood in the kitchen with me, and I felt the ache of recognition and relief twine together until I could not tell one from the other. She had thought of everything. Not a grand ballroom or a downtown hotel, but a vineyard north of the city where the hills fold into one another and the afternoon light turns the air the color of honey. They would marry beneath an oak whose branches looked almost architectural against the sky. The dinner would be long tables with linen runners and wildflowers in bottles, a band that knew when to be invisible and when to lift a room. She had a folder on her phone with sketches, vendor notes, and a timeline that would make a project manager proud. She did not ask for money. That was the first thing I noticed. It shamed me a little that she had learned to build a life that never put me in the position of choosing. I told her we wanted to contribute anyway, not to own a piece of her day, but to honor it. My husband nodded so quickly it felt like a reflex. We set an amount, and she accepted with gratitude that made me wish I had offered more. The weeks that followed were a procession of careful choices. Clara let me into the process without surrendering the helm. She invited me to the dress fitting even though she could have gone alone. In the mirror, wrapped in satin that held her like an agreement, she did not look like a princess. She looked like a woman who had said yes to her own future. I held the pins and pretended not to cry, and when I failed, she pretended not to see. Wah. Tasted cakes at a bakery that smelled like vanilla and hot sugar. We debated buttercream versus ganache as if the world hinged on the difference. She sent me photos of table settings, and I sent her restaurant recommendations for the rehearsal. Dinner. We passed a dozen small torches back and forth and managed not to burn each other. For once, our rhythm felt easy, as though all the years of distance had softened into something we could step across. Sophie hovered at the edges of these preparations like a faint echo. She would drift through the dining room and ask a question, with a tone that held both curiosity and caution. She tried on my bracelets in the hall and left them on the table as if she wanted me to notice she had returned them. Sometimes she smiled, a quick flash that vanished before it had the chance to land. Other times she grew quiet in a way I recognized too well, the hush of someone bracing for an impact no one else can see. I did not want to disturb the balance. I told myself this moment belonged to Clara and that it was my job to protect it, to make up for every time I had not protected her before. So I leaned into the planning. I learned the language of lead times and delivery windows. I found myself waking at 3 a.m. to check emails and confirm details. It was not just a wedding we were building. It was a bridge, fragile, but real, plank by plank. There were signals, of course. There always are. Late one night, Clara sent me a list of songs she wanted the band to learn, and as I played them on my phone, I noticed a missed call from Sophie. When I rang back, she did not answer. The next day, she hugged me in the kitchen and held on a moment too long. I told myself it was sentiment, nothing more. I set another vendor call. I sealed another envelope. I kept my eyes on the horizon. The day Clara bought her shoes, we stopped for coffee. She showed me a photo of the oak tree at the vineyard, the way the light laced through its branches at dusk. She said she wanted to exchange vows as the sun dropped behind the hills, that she had looked up the exact minute civil twilight would begin. Her certainty felt like a blessing. For the first time in years, I let myself believe that a door had opened and I could walk through it with her. On a Tuesday, just as I was finalizing the floral contract, my phone buzzed with Sophie's name. Her voice was small, breath clipped at the edges. She asked if I could meet her alone, today, if possible. She said there was something I needed to know, something that could not wait. And in that instant, the quiet world we had arranged around Clara's joy began to tilt, ever so slightly, toward the edge of a cliff. Sophie asked me to meet her at a small cafe not far from our house, a place she rarely chose. She arrived, early, sitting in the corner where the light from the window slanted across her face. When I walked in, she wasn't scrolling her phone or sipping coffee. She was just staring at her hands as though they belonged to someone else. I knew then that whatever she was about to tell me would not be ordinary. Her eyes darted up when I sat down, then back to her hands. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, so I reached for her wrist, gently. She flinched, not from the touch but from the weight of what she carried. And then, in a voice so fragile I almost missed it, she said, "Mom, I'm pregnant." The word seemed to change the air around us. Pregnant. I heard it once, and again, as if it were echoing against the walls of the cafe. She pressed her lips together, fighting tears, and confessed that she and Evan had not planned it, that he was uncertain about everything, their future, his role, even the child itself. She whispered that he had already begun pulling away, leaving, her in the space between promise and abandonment. I felt my heart lurch. The mother in me wanted to fold her into my arms, to make it all disappear with a single assurance. But beneath that impulse came another thought, quieter but insistent. Clara's wedding. 2 months away. Every detail already in motion. Every plan resting on balance. Sophie wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, her desperation spilling out in a rush. "If I get married before the baby is born, people will see us as a family, not a mistake. But we can't afford a venue. We can't plan anything in time. What if—" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "What if we used Clara's vineyard? Just this once? What if I got married there before she does?" The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, impossible to ignore. She looked at me with pleading eyes that seemed to say I was her last chance. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. My mind split into 2 halves, one seeing Clara's face the moment she found out, the other hearing Sophie's cries for salvation. I nodded vaguely, not because I agreed, but because I couldn't bear to shatter her hope in that moment. My chest felt tight, as if the walls of the cafe had closed in. I told her I needed to think, that we would find a way, though I had no idea how. That night, I lay awake beside my husband, staring at the ceiling. When I finally told him what Sophie had said, his answer was firm, unyielding. "No, don't even suggest it. Clara will never forgive us." He warned me that it would be chaos, that Sophie's desperation was not reason enough to steal her sister's moment. But the sound of her trembling voice haunted me, circling in my mind until it silenced. Reason. By morning, a thought had taken root. Maybe Clara wouldn't have to give up her wedding completely. Maybe she could share it, just one compromise, one adjustment, for the sake of her sister, for the sake of the unborn child. Wasn't that what families were meant to do? To bend for each other when life demanded it? I set the table as if ceremony could soften a hard conversation. Linen napkins instead of paper. A bowl of late berries rinsed until they gleamed. The good plates that only come out for holidays. I told myself it was hospitality, but it was staging. I wanted the morning to feel gentle, as if kindness could hold the weight of what I was about to ask. Clara arrived with a bottle of sparkling water and that organized calm she wears like a well-tailored coat. Sophie came a few minutes later, late enough to be noticed, early enough to pretend she wasn't. My husband busied himself with coffee, a silent metronome in the background. We made small talk that felt like walking a narrow ledge. In the center of the table sat an envelope thick with vendor receipts and timelines, a physical proof of how far Clara had carried her own dream. I cleared my throat. The room stilled. I told Clara there was something we needed to share before the day ran away from us. Sophie looked at me, then down at her hands. I took the confession for her because she had asked me to. I said the word that had changed the air in the cafe the day before. Pregnant. Clara's face changed, but not in the way I feared. She rose first, crossed to Sophie, and wrapped her arms around her. It was instinct, not performance. She asked if she was feeling well, if she had seen a doctor if she needed anything. In that brief pocket of tenderness, I remembered the girls in the back seat singing along to a song I can no longer name. I let the memory warm me for a second too long. Then I moved to the question I had rehearsed in my head until the sentences lost their edges. I said we were glad for the news, grateful for the life it promised, and worried about how quickly life rearranges itself. I said weddings are expensive, time is short, the calendar unkind. I said families bend when they must. I told her Sophie, and Evan hoped to marry before the baby came. They had no plan, no savings, no venue. The vineyard, I said, already reserved, already paid in part, already holding a date that fit. The oak tree, the hillside, the long tables waiting for linen. It would be a kindness. It would be one day. It would save Sophie from the story people tell when a ring and a birth certificate do not arrive in the expected order. Are you asking me to give up my wedding? I tried to soften it. Not give up, not entirely. Perhaps just move it. Or let Sophie use the date and the place, and we would find another weekend for Clara. The vendors could be rearranged, the band rebooked, the guests notified. People would understand. Sisters do this for each other. Families do this when life demands it. Clara exhaled, a sound that carried years. She said she loved her sister and wished the timing were different. She said she would help with appointments, with prenatal care, with errands, with anything that did not dismantle the life she had built around a single day she had waited for her whole life. She said no. The word landed quietly, but it had edges. Sophie flinched as if it had struck her. I stepped in, as I always have. I reminded Clara of Sophie's hospital nights, the panic attacks, the mornings that began with tears. I said Clara had always been the strong one, that my request did not come from favoritism, but from necessity. I told her this was about protecting a child who had not asked to arrive in turbulence. Clara's face did not harden. It emptied. She pressed her fingertips to the table as if feeling for an anchor. She spoke slowly, as if translating herself to a language I might finally hear. I am not a substitute teacher for my own life. I am not the reliable shelf where you place someone else's emergency. I have spent years being the strong one. I will not let strength be the reason I lose what I love. Sophie pushed back her chair. The scrape against the floor sounded louder than it should have. She accused Clara of hoarding good fortune, of guarding joy as if there would never be enough to share. Her voice climbed. The room shrank. I reached for her, missed, reached again. I said we could find a way, that compromise is not surrender, that generosity today would be returned tomorrow in ways none of us could predict. Clara looked at me, not angry, not pleading, only tired. She said the simplest sentence in the room. This is my wedding. Silence thickened. The berries bled into their bowl. The steam from the coffee thinned and disappeared. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears and found myself bargaining with logic I would not recognize a year later. We had already put money down, I said, as if the ledger could make the moral math easier. We could move the deposit to a later date. We could talk to the planner. We could find a creative solution if she would just meet us halfway. Clara pushed the envelope of papers toward me. Keep it if you need proof of how much this matters. Then she stood, took her coat, and said she loved us but would not be negotiating the one day she had allowed herself to want without apology. When the latch clicked, the kitchen seemed to tilt. Sophie folded into herself, grief boiling into something hotter. She called Clara selfish. She called me blind. My husband told me we had gone far enough. The words hovered like smoke that would not clear. I spent that night assembling arguments the way a lawyer builds a case, lining up reasons, outcomes, sacrifices owed, and sacrifices already made. By morning, I had convinced myself I had not asked for theft, but for mercy. If Clara could not give the day, perhaps she could at least share it. 2 vows, 1 oak, a timetable adjusted by an hour. A family gathered around both daughters at once. The house changed temperature after that breakfast, as if someone had opened a window in winter and forgotten to close it. Conversation shrank to logistics. Drawers closed more carefully. Even the dog slept with one eye open, as though he, too, understood something had shifted and could not shift back. My husband said little. He rinsed his coffee mug and left it upside down to dry, the same way he does every morning, but the gesture felt like a verdict. When he finally spoke, it was without drama, which somehow made it harsher. You ask too much. If you keep pushing, you will break what is left. He did not say my name. He did not need to. Sophie moved through rooms like a storm that refused to rain. 1 minute contrite, the next railing at air. She stacked prenatal vitamins beside the sink and then knocked them over with the back of her hand, as if the clatter might wake me into the mother she wanted. She said Clara was selfish, that people who were handed easy roads never learned to share them. She said a baby deserved a proper beginning. She said the vineyard had space for 2 vows if Clara cared enough to make room. I told myself she was frightened, not cruel. Fear can make good people sound like villains. I told myself that years from now, this would be a story we laughed about. The almost disaster we avoided by choosing one another. But the truth sat in my chest like a stone. Clara had said no, and I had not accepted it. That was the first fracture I could name. Clara's message arrived that afternoon. Not a speech. A few lines that wore the calm of a lawyer who had learned how to keep her voice even when the room was on fire. She said she loved us. She said she would help Sophie in the ways she could. She said the wedding remained where she had said it and that the subject was closed. Then she thanked me for understanding and ended with a wish about a quiet weekend to recover from the mourning. The courtesy of it stung more than anger would have. I typed several replies, each more measured than the last. I told myself I would only clarify, never pressure. I told myself I was simply asking for perspective. I deleted them all. What I wanted to write was not what I should say, and what I should say did not feel like enough. That evening, Sophie stood in the doorway while I chopped onions and asked if I had ever once chosen her when it mattered. The question was not a question. I reminded her of school meetings, hospital nights, bills paid in whispers. She shook her head, furious at an arithmetic she didn't recognize. Choosing is not the same as making me your cause. You picked a part, to play, and you liked how you looked in it. The words landed and stayed. I heard my husband set his fork down in the other room and not pick it up again. Guilt is a busy architect. It builds while you sleep. By morning, a scaffold had gone up in my mind, a structure that could hold both daughters if I arranged the beams just so. I told myself I was not asking Clara to yield the day, only to share the light that fell on it. 2 women under the oak, one promise following the other, a schedule written with care. I played it like a film in my head until it began to seem inevitable. Compromise, I called it. Mercy with a timetable. When conscience argued, I argued back. I said no one gets everything, not even the worthy. I said families bend or they break. I said the world is cruel to unmarried mothers and that love is not love if it lets shame stand. At the front of the church, I said Clara had spent a lifetime shouldering more and had never fallen. I said Sophie would fall if I did not hold her up now. Each sentence sounded reasonable by itself. Together, they formed a net I pretended was a bridge. The small signs multiplied. In the family group chat, Clara posted a photo of her shoes and a caption about breaking them in before the big day. Sophie answered with a heart and then sent another. Message to me alone, asking why a shoe deserved celebration when a baby had no date for his parents to say I do. I watched the dots pulse, then vanish, then return, as if the phone itself could not decide how to be kind. At dinner, I reached for the old language. Be the bigger sister. Help me protect her. You have room to give. Clara had called to confirm cake flavors, and I put her on speaker without thinking. She went quiet for a long beat and then said she had been the bigger sister since she could spell the word. She said she would drop by the bakery on her own. She said she loved me and would call tomorrow. It was not what she said that broke me. It was what she did not ask. That night, sleep would not come. I made tea and stood at the kitchen sink, the light above the stove making a small island in the dark. Across the room, the folder of contracts and seating charts glowed in a rectangle of soft gold. I opened it and traced my finger along the timeline Clara had built. It was a marvel of order. I stood there and imagined one more column, one more line of type. Ceremony 2, adjusted by an hour. I saw it fit without tearing anything. On paper, almost anything fits. The next morning, I called the planner. I told myself it was only a feasibility question. She listened kindly, and then, with the caution of someone diffusing a live wire, said that 2 ceremonies in one day were possible in theory, but brutal in practice. Vendors would balk, timelines would slip, guests would be confused. The bride might feel erased in ways she would not understand until the photographs came back. She said she would do what her client wanted, and her client was Clara. She said these decisions prefer to be made by people who sleep well after making them. When I hung up, I stared at the silent phone and felt both chastened and emboldened. Warnings had a way of sounding like challenges when guilt needed a partner. I told myself that if the logistics could be managed, the rest would follow. I told myself that once Clara saw how carefully I had thought it through, how little of her day would be disturbed, she would take my hand and say what a good mother does when she is trying to love 2 children at once. My husband watched me from the doorway. He asked what I was planning. I said I was planning nothing. He shook his head the way a man does when he recognizes the ship already leaving the harbor. You cannot rescue one daughter by drowning the other. He left the room as if closing a door, but he had not touched one. Sophie stood in the hall later, pale with morning sickness and fear, and pressed my knuckles to her cheek. She said she could hear the baby's heartbeat at her next appointment. She asked if I would come. I said yes. Of course I said yes. The promise attached itself to every other promise I had made, a chain I carried without looking to see where it was anchored. The cracks were no longer hairline. They ran across conversations and split the simplest moments open. I told myself I was sealing them with care, that all I needed was the right pitch, the right timing, the right invitation dressed in gentleness. If Clara would not surrender the day, perhaps she would lend its edges. So I set another lunch. I arranged my words like place settings and practiced them until they sounded soft. I would not ask her to cancel. I would ask her to share. 2 vows beneath the oak, separated not by love, but by an hour and a change of flowers. I convinced myself this was not theft. I called it balance. And with that belief steadying my hand, I reached for the phone to invite Clara back to the table, certain that a gentler request would rescue what a blunt one had endangered, unaware that I was stepping over a line I would not be able to redraw. I wanted the second invitation to feel like a peace offering, not a summons. No fanfare this time. Just soup on the stove and the window cracked to let in a mild afternoon. I set 3 bowls, though there were 4 of us in the house. My husband said he would join later, which meant he preferred to listen from the next room. Clara arrived on time, hair still damp from a run, the calm of someone who keeps appointments. With herself. Sophie drifted in a few minutes after, a hand pressed to her stomach as if steadying more than morning sickness. I began with contrition. I told them I had asked badly the first time, that I had let worry twist my words. I said, I heard Clara's no and respected it. I said we were not here to unmake her day. I watched her shoulders ease a fraction. She reached for a spoon. Sophie stared at the steam. Only then did I introduce the idea I had carried around like a fragile glass, turning it over for flaws I refused to see. Not cancellation, not replacement, sharing. One afternoon beneath the oak. 2 ceremonies, separated by an hour. 2 sets of vows, 2 walks down the aisle, 1 band that could play softer when the light changed. The vineyard already held the date. We would not be asking more of it, only asking it to hold twice as much love. Photographs could be scheduled. So nothing bled together. A change of flowers between ceremonies, so each woman had her own palette. I laid it out like a plan that honored balance and kept faith with both stories at once. Clara did not interrupt. She listened the way lawyers do, with stillness that reads as patience, until you realize it is also defense. When I finished, she set her spoon down. What do you mean, share? The words were flat, but not unkind. Exactly what it sounds like, I said. Your day remains yours. Sophie has her ceremony first or after, whichever you prefer. We set a clear schedule. Your guests attend your ceremony, her guests attend hers. The reception could be a joint dinner or staggered. We keep everything dignified, and separate where it must be. The oak can hold both promises. Sophie found her voice. I do not need the whole day, Clara, just a doorway into a respectable beginning. I need a place to stand so the baby does not start life under a cloud. You have everything lined up. I have nothing. Clara's gaze moved between us. She touched the napkin as if checking the texture for truth. She said, a vineyard is not a church. Hall with folding chairs. She said vendors are contracted to a timeline measured in 5-minute increments. She said a wedding is not a public square where slots are assigned and traded. She said she had planned for 6 months because this was not something she wanted to improvise, not after a childhood of improvising. I told her we would hire extra staff. I had already spoken to the planner about feasibility, I said, and while it would be tight, it was possible. We would absorb the additional cost. No detail would fall on her shoulders. I kept my voice soft, as if softness could make a difficult request gentle. My husband stepped into the doorway, a dish towel over his shoulder, the posture of a man who would prefer to be anywhere else. He said it was not a question for logistics. He said it was a question for the heart that had to carry it. He told me quietly to stop. Then he went back to the sink as if leaving the scene could undo it. Clara folded her hands. She did not raise her voice. She said she loved her sister and cared about the baby. She said she would help in every way that did not make her disappear from her own wedding. She said she would not split the day, not carve it into halves, not let the photographs tell 2 stories on 1 frame. She said no. Again. As if repetition might teach me the shape of the boundary. Sophie's restraint broke. She accused Clara of protecting a tablecloth while a life waited without a name. She said comfort had made Clara small, that people with blessings fear sharing them because it exposes how little they trust the world to give more. The words struck their target and kept going. Even after she stopped speaking, they seemed to ring. I reached for the old argument because it has always been within reach. Be the steady one, I said to Clara. Sometimes the person who can carry more must carry more. It is not punishment. It is the math families live by. Clara looked right at me. Math, she said, has rules. What you are describing is not math, it is extraction. You take from the person who will not scream because they will not make a scene. You call that generosity. It is not. Silence pressed in. Outside, a neighbor's lawnmower started and stopped, the brief roar of a life that did not care about ours. I felt the familiar panic, the room narrowing, the need to fix tightening around my throat until there was no air left for listening. I said we had put money down, thinking the ledger might persuade where love had failed. I said we could move deposits, swap times, that any damage could be mended if we approached it as a team. I said it all in a rush, hearing how desperate I sounded and resenting the mirror of it. Sophie stepped into her path. Her face was wet and furious. Do you hear yourself? You talk about clean and kind while I drown. You would watch me sink to protect a dress code. She moved closer, and for a breath it looked like they might collide. I put a hand between them. For a second it worked. Clara turned to leave. The chair legs scraped. Something inside me, old and unexamined, surged. A mother who had always stepped in, took charge, made a call, and expected the room to bend. My hand rose before thought could catch it. The sound of the slap was small, almost delicate. The real noise was the quiet that followed. Clara did not touch her cheek. She did not cry. She looked at me as if studying a landmark she had misremembered. When she spoke, her voice was softer than mine had ever been. Then you have lost me. My husband's towel fell to the floor. Sophie gasped, then said my name as if I were both her refuge and her ruin. I took a step toward Clara, and she stepped back, palm raised in a stop that felt final. Do not come to my wedding, she said. Do not call. I will repay what you contributed. I will not let this happen again. She left with her coat over her arm, the door closing with the mercy of a gentle hinge. The house held its breath. Sophie sobbed into her hands. I stood in my kitchen and stared at the hand I had used, as if it belonged to someone I had judged harshly in a story I did not think was mine. By evening, an email arrived, brief and precise, repeating what she had said out loud. No attendance. No contact. A promise to send a check. My husband read it, set his glasses on the table, and went upstairs without a word. I told myself bans are temporary. Daughters and mothers do not stay erased. I convinced myself that when the day came and she saw my face at the gate, her heart would remember what my head had forgotten. I clung to the certainties that had failed me before, that family outruns outrage, that milestones make room for forgiveness, that a mother cannot be left on the wrong side of her child's door. I slept in that belief like a too thin blanket, shivering and stubborn. In the morning, I ironed a dress I had no right to wear, folded it over a hanger, and told Sophie we would keep our heads high. The plan formed itself without my consent. We would go early. We would take our place. We would be let in, the rest would soften. I was wrong, and the proof would meet us at the vineyard gate. The days after Clara walked out were hushed, as if the house itself was ashamed to speak. Sophie spent hours in her room, emerging only to accuse me in half-broken sentences that Clara had humiliated her, that I had not defended her enough, that the world had always chosen Clara first. My husband, meanwhile, spoke less and less, his silence heavier than any argument. He read the paper at dinner without turning a page, as though the print were nothing more than camouflage for his absence. Clara's email sat in my inbox like a sealed door. She wrote with the same precision she had always carried into her school essays. You are not to attend my wedding. You are not to contact me further until after the event. Any financial contribution will be returned in full." I read it once, twice, 10 times, as if repetition could transform it into a draft, something still open to negotiation. But it was not a draft, it was a decree. I told myself this was anger speaking, that no child could truly mean to cut her. Mother out of the most important day of her life. Daughters might flare with temper, but the bond always wins. That was the refrain I clung to in the quiet, the lullaby I hummed to myself when sleep would not come. Sophie, however, treated Clara's words like a confirmation of every fear she had harbored. She paced the hallway, muttering that Clara had been plotting this all along, that the engagement, the vineyard, the dress fittings were less about love and more about outshining her. I tried to soothe her, told her Clara would calm down, that anger burns quickly. But Sophie shook her head with the certainty of the betrayed. She doesn't want me there because she doesn't want anyone to see me. She wants me erased. The guilt pressed in from both sides. On one, Clara's quiet firmness. On the other, Sophie's unraveling desperation. I stood in the middle, a bridge no one trusted to hold. At night, I stared at the ceiling and wondered when I had lost the authority to comfort either of them. My husband offered no rescue. One evening when I said perhaps Clara would change her mind by the wedding day, he finally lowered his paper. His voice was calm, stripped of everything but finality. "If you show up uninvited, you will not only lose Clara, you will lose me." Then he folded the paper, stood, and left the room without waiting for my reply. Yet even his warning could not dislodge the conviction growing inside me. Clara might say the words, but she would not follow through. A daughter cannot bar her mother from crossing the threshold of her wedding. The thought was absurd, unnatural, unkind. I rehearsed that belief until it became unshakable. I even began to prepare. I had Sophie fitted for a dress that was dignified but not bridal, something that whispered presence rather than spectacle. I chose a softer shade for myself, as if color could make me invisible enough to be forgiven. We would arrive early, I told Sophie. We would take our seats quietly. By the time Clara walked down the aisle, she would see us there, and though she might frown at first, her heart would remember. She would not turn away her own blood, I said. This to Sophie, again and again, until she began to believe it too. Her fear shifted into something like anticipation. She pressed her hand to her belly and whispered that perhaps the baby would be the reason Clara forgave us. I nodded, though I knew forgiveness born from a child is never truly forgiveness at all. I clung to the vision of the vineyard, the oak tree, the music rising as Clara walked toward her vows. I saw myself there, seated among the guests, a mother watching her child step into joy. I convinced myself that this vision was destiny, not delusion. But the truth was already waiting at the edge of that imagined day. And when it came, it would not wait quietly. It would meet me at the gate, with witnesses, with phones, with the cold certainty of a choice I refused to hear. We left before the sun found its height, Sophie and I, dressed in compromise. Her gown was modest and pale, mine quieter still, the kind of fabric that asks permission simply by how softly it falls. I told myself we were early enough to be invisible, that punctuality could pass for permission. My husband did not come. He watched from the doorway as we walked to the car and said nothing, and his silence followed us down the street like a shadow that refused to break. The vineyard sat behind a low stone wall and a gate of black iron. Beyond it, the hills lifted like folded cloth. Vines combed into rows so neat they seemed drawn with a ruler. Somewhere a band tuned a trumpet. I could smell crushed grass and the faint sweetness of grapes warming in light. For a moment, the scene almost convinced me I was right to be there. A man in a dark suit stepped forward from a small podium. He had a tablet in his hand and the patient face of someone who has said no many times. Names, please. I gave him mine. He scanned. He asked for Sophie's. He scanned again. Then he looked up, careful with his words. I took out my invitation and held it as if paper could unlock a gate. He glanced at it and kept his voice even. Ma'am, the list is current. The bride's team updated it this morning. I asked him to call inside. He said he already had instructions. I felt the ground tilt, only a little at first. We are her family, I said. The words sounded old-fashioned, like a spell missing its ending. Please try again. He lifted the radio clip to his lapel and spoke into it. Whatever answer came back did not reach me. Only the polite firmness in his eyes did. I asked to speak to the coordinator, to anyone with authority. He said the person with authority had been very clear. They came in pairs and clusters, summer, dresses and suits in light colors, light laughter, light perfume. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat slowed when she saw us. A man with a camera pretended to check his lens while angling it our way. Phones appeared the way phones do, quietly and everywhere. I felt the small bite of a dozen eyes deciding who we were. Sophie's. Breath shortened. She pressed her palm to her belly and whispered that she might faint. I told her to sit on the low wall. The guard looked worried and offered water, which somehow felt like both mercy and surveillance. Then, from inside the gate, movement. Clara walked toward us with 2 attendants behind her. Her dress was simple and exact, the kind that knows its own line and never apologizes for it. The veil was still folded back, her hair pinned the way. I had watched the stylist pin it at the trial, my hands useless at my sides. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with ornament. She was also resolute, and it showed first in her eyes. She stood close enough that I could see the pale seam where the bodice met the skirt. She did not raise her voice. I'm not going to let this happen again. You tried to move the ground under my feet once. You will not do it on the day I stand here. I want you to leave. Sophie stepped toward her. The guard, still polite, moved between them with practiced grace. Guests nearest the gate had stopped pretending not to watch. A whisper rolled through the group like wind in dry leaves. I saw a woman lift her phone and tilt it, her mouth a small O that promised a story later. A laugh bubbled from somewhere in the small crowd, the kind people use when they are glad the spectacle is not theirs. I felt heat rise in my face and throat. Rage is a kind of dizziness. It makes the world shrink to the space in front of you. I told Clara she was ungrateful, that she had forgotten every late night and early morning I had given our family, that she was punishing me for being the mother who showed up more for the child who needed more. I heard myself and did not stop. If you send us away, I said, you will regret it. The attendants shifted. A planner with a clipboard approached, the posture of someone ready to absorb impact. She murmured that guests were beginning to back up on the path, that the officiant had arrived, that the quartet was asking whether to begin prelude. In the distance, the oak stood like architecture against the sky, its branches holding a patch of shade that looked almost holy. For a long second, no one moved. Then the guard stepped aside, just enough for Clara to pass back through the gate. She paused, as if there might still be something worth saying that had not yet been said. There was not. She lifted her hand to the planner in a small signal and walked away, satin skimming gravel, veil catching a little light, and then letting it go. The gate swung in and clicked softly into its latch. The sound, so ordinary, carried a finality that did not. Sophie made a sound I had not heard since she was 10, a sound of breakage rather than tears. She tried to follow. The guard was gentle and firm. I stood very still because movement would have meant crumpling. Beyond the wall, music began, the first notes of a song Clara had sent me weeks ago, with a line that read simply, "I think this will feel right at the tree."